Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. And before we dive into the story, my mum said we can't get to 1,000 subscribers. Can you help me prove her wrong? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and be part of this journey. Let's show her what we can do. Now, let's dive into the story. The rope hit the dirt before Soledad Van even understood what was happening. She was 14 years old, barefoot in the dust of their crumbling front porch in Cobre Ridge, New Mexico, and her mother was standing across from a man she had never seen before. He was wide as a barn door, with silver rings on every finger, and a smile that held no warmth. The sky behind them was the color of a bruise, deep purple fading to orange at the edges, the sun dragging itself below the mesa like it didn't want to watch. Soledad had come outside to fetch the washing. She hadn't expected to walk into the moment that would split her life in two. Her mother, Delia Van, had her arms crossed tight over her chest, and her eyes, dark and restless as river water, were not looking at her daughter at all. They were looking at the man's coat pocket, where a leather pouch sat round and heavy with coin. "She's strong," Delia said, her voice flat as hammered tin. "Knows how to cook, how to clean, how to keep her mouth shut when it matters." The man, who would later introduce himself as Harlan Cross, tilted his head and studied Soledad the way a buyer studies livestock at a fair. He circled slowly. His boots scraped the dry earth. Soledad felt her stomach drop through the floor of the world. She looked at her mother, waiting for a laugh, a correction, a signal that this was some terrible misunderstanding. None came. Delia Van's jaw was set like stone. The leather pouch changed hands in one quiet, deliberate motion. Soledad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The wind off the canyon stirred the dust around her feet in lazy spirals. She was not dreaming. This was real. Her own mother had just accepted money in exchange for her. The rope Harlan Cross held was not for horses. He took one step toward her, and that was when the sound of hooves shattered the evening like a gunshot. The rider came fast from the north trail, a broad silhouette against the bruised sky, his horse kicking up a wall of red dust that rolled across the yard like a wave. He reined in hard, just 10 feet from the porch, and his horse reared once before settling, blowing hard through its nostrils. The man who climbed down was Cormac Van, tall, weathered, dressed in a rancher's worn canvas coat with dust caked into every crease. He was Soledad's father in name only, Delia always said. He had left when Soledad was 3. He had come back twice in her memory. Once, when the river flooded. Once, when her grandmother died. But right now, with his eyes moving from the leather pouch in Delia's hand to the rope in Harlan Cross's fist to his daughter's pale, frozen face, Cormac Van looked like a man who had ridden through fire to arrive exactly on time. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. That was the most terrifying part. "Put that rope down," he said. "Now." Harlan Cross didn't put the rope down. He squared his shoulders and looked Cormac over with the slow, measuring gaze of a man who had bought and sold his way through life and never once been denied. "This ain't your business," he said. "The woman made an agreement. Money's been passed. Transaction's done." Cormac didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a weapon. He took 3 steps forward until he stood between Harlan Cross and his daughter, and the space between the 2 men became the most dangerous ground in all of New Mexico. Soledad could see her father's hands, broad, scarred, steady, at his sides. She could see the muscle in his jaw working. She could see, for the first time in her 14 years, that this man wouldn't move. Not for money. Not for threats. Not for anything on God's dry earth. The agreement, Cormac said softly, is void. Harlan Cross's smile finally dropped. The evening held its breath. What happened next lasted less than 2 minutes, but burned itself into Soledad's memory forever. Harlan Cross reached into his coat. Cormac moved faster than a man his age had any right to move, one hand catching Cross's wrist, the other driving an elbow into the man's ribs with a sound like a door slamming. The pouch of coins hit the dirt and scattered silver across the dust. Harlan Cross stumbled back, gasping, rage twisting his face. But something in Cormac's stillness, the absolute, unshakable calm of a man with nothing left to lose, made Cross calculate. He looked at the coins on the ground. He looked at Cormac. He looked at Delia, who had pressed, herself back against the porch post, her arms still crossed, her face unreadable. Then Harlan Cross picked up his rope, turned around, and walked to his horse without another word. He rode north. He did not look back. Cormac Van turned to his daughter. The sun was fully gone now, and in the grey dusk his eyes were filled with something that looked very much like grief. "Get your things," he said quietly. "You're coming with me." And just like that, Soledad Van's old life ended, and the terrifying, beautiful, unknowable new one began. Cormac Van's ranch sat 12 miles east of Cobra Ridge, tucked into a valley where 2 dry creek beds met beneath a stand of ancient cottonwood trees. The house was not beautiful. It was built from hand-cut sandstone and rough timber, its roof patched in 3 places, its front door hung slightly crooked on leather hinges. But it was solid. It did not lean in the wind. It did not apologize for itself. When Soledad first saw it in the grey pre-dawn, light from the back of her father's horse, wrapped in his spare coat that smelled of cedar and saddle oil, she felt something she couldn't name settle in her chest. Not comfort exactly, more like the recognition of a place that had been waiting. She had not spoken during the ride. Cormac had not pushed her. They had moved through the dark desert together in silence, the horse's hooves steady on the packed earth, the stars enormous above them, the cold biting at her cheeks and ears. Over the following 3 days, Soledad learned the truth about her parents' history in pieces, some from Cormac's careful, reluctant words, some from a weathered letter she found in the cedar box beneath his cot, and some from simply watching the man move through his life. Cormac and Delia Van had married young, too young, both of them, in a small ceremony in Cobra Ridge's only church. Cormac had been 22, already working cattle on another man's land, dreaming of his own spread. Delia had been 19 and full of a restless hunger that the desert town could never satisfy. For 3 years they had been, if not happy, then at least committed to the project of happiness. Then Soledad was born, and the drought came, and the money ran thin as January ice, and something in Delia's patience simply broke and did not repair itself. Delia Van was not a villain in the way of stories. She was not cruel for pleasure, not cold by nature. She was a woman built for motion, who had been trapped in stillness, and the trap had warped her. Cormac understood this. He had understood it even as she asked him to leave, even as she told him she could manage better alone. What he had not understood, what he could not forgive himself for, was taking her at her word. He had left. He had sent money when he could, which was not always often enough. He had told himself Soledad was fine. He had told himself Delia would never truly harm their daughter. He had been wrong. And the weight of that wrongness showed in every line of his face, in the way he moved through the morning slowly, as though carrying something invisible and very heavy. On the fourth morning, Soledad woke before dawn and found Cormac already at the stove, making coffee with the serious concentration of a man performing a ritual. She sat at the rough wooden table and watched him. She had her mother's eyes, dark and restless, but her father's jaw, strong and set. Cormac poured 2 cups without being asked, set one in front of her, and sat across the table. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who did not yet have the language for everything they needed to say. After a long moment, Soledad wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him directly. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "I mean, that night." "Why then?" Cormac looked at his coffee for a moment. "Someone in town saw Cross a ride toward your mother's place," he said. "Told me what he'd heard." He paused. "I should have come back a lot sooner than that." She didn't answer right away. Outside, the first pale light was beginning to streak the eastern sky, turning the cottonwoods from black shapes to silver green. A rooster somewhere on the property announced the morning with tireless enthusiasm. Soledad thought about her mother, about the crossed arms, the flat voice, the deliberate avoidance of her daughter's eyes in that terrible moment. She thought about the leather pouch. She thought about the coins scattered in the dust. She thought about all the smaller betrayals that had preceded that one. The times Delia had called her useless. The times she'd been sent to sleep without supper. The way her mother would sometimes look at her with an expression that was not love and not hate, but something colder than either. Something like regret. And she thought about this man across from her now. This father who smelled like cedar and worked his hands raw before sunup, who had ridden through the dark to stand between her and a rope. "Sooner would have been good," she said finally. And for the first time since she had arrived, something almost like a smile crossed Cormac Van's weathered face. The ranch ran cattle, 43 head of mixed longhorn and shorthorn, plus 6 horses, 2 mules and a goat named Persimmon, who had no practical purpose, but whom Cormac tolerated with the resigned affection of a man who knew when he'd been outmaneuvered by an animal. There were also 2 ranch hands, an older man named Ezra Flood, who was 60 and moved as though his bones were held together by stubbornness and tobacco smoke, and a younger man named Tomas Baca, 19 years old, with quick dark eyes and a gift for fixing anything mechanical that others had given up on. Soledad moved through her first week at the ranch like a person learning to walk on new ground, carefully, testing each step, aware of the possibility of falling. She helped where she could. She rose before the sun. She did not complain. These were habits her childhood had burned into her, though the childhood had been unkind. Ezra Flood took her measure on the 2nd day and delivered his verdict on the 3rd, which was his way. He appeared beside her while she was hauling water to the trough, studied her for a full 30 seconds, and then said, "You've got your daddy's stubbornness. That's useful out here." He walked away before she could respond. Tomas Baca was more immediately friendly, in the careful way of a young man who had been raised to be respectful around new people, especially young women. He showed her how to check a horse's hooves for stones, how to read the sky for weather coming off the mountains, how to patch a fence line without wasting wire. He did these things without condescension, which Soledad noticed and appreciated. She had spent 14 years being spoken to, as though her intelligence were a minor inconvenience. Being spoken to as though it were ordinary felt strange and good. The work was hard. The desert did not soften itself for anyone's comfort. The water had to be hauled from the well every morning. The cattle had to be moved between grazing patches on a rotating schedule. Cormac managed in a worn notebook he kept in his coat pocket. Fences broke. Tools broke. The weather did whatever it wanted, with no regard for human plans. But Soledad found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind the hardness of it. There was honesty in it. Every task had a beginning, a middle, and a visible end. Every morning there were things to do, and every evening there was the satisfaction, quiet and solid, of having done them. This was different from her life in Cobre Ridge, where the daily labor had been endless and invisible, soaking into her mother's indifference like water into dry sand, leaving no trace of itself. At the end of the second week, Cormac sat her down and told her about a man named Aldous Reese. Reese owned the neighboring property, 2,000 acres of grass and water rights that ran along the north edge of Cormac's land. He was a large, prosperous rancher, with 4 grown sons and a reputation for acquiring what he wanted through persistence, and, when persistence failed, through pressure. For 2 years he had been making offers on Cormac's ranch. The offers had been refused. In the months before Soledad arrived, the refusals had begun to cost something. A fence cut here, cattle spooked there, a water diversion that had mysteriously appeared upstream where none had existed before. Cormac said all of this quietly, watching his daughter's face for signs of fear. What he saw instead was something that looked very much like attention. She was listening the way a person listens when they understand that the information matters. "Is he dangerous?" Soledad asked. Cormac considered the question seriously, as he did all serious questions. "He's the kind of man who thinks he can buy anything," he said. "And, when he finds out he can't, he decides the problem must be fixed some other way." He paused. "I've dealt with men like him before. I just need time." Soledad thought of Harlan Cross's silver rings and the leather pouch changing hands. She thought of the way money could turn a person, even a person you loved, into something you didn't recognize. "What do you need from me?" she asked. The question surprised him. His eyebrows moved slightly. He hadn't expected to be asked that. Hadn't expected a 14-year-old girl who had just had her world overturned to offer herself as useful. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Right now," he said, "keep your eyes open. This valley talks, if you know how to listen." She nodded. She had been listening to things her whole life. She was very good at it. A month into her new life, a letter arrived from Cobre Ridge. Cormac brought it in from the post rider without comment and set it on the table beside Soledad's breakfast plate. Her name was on the front in her mother's handwriting, small, precise letters that slanted slightly to the right, as though they were always leaning away from something. Soledad looked at it for a long time before she picked it up. She turned it over in her hands. The seal was intact. Whatever was inside had not been read by anyone else. She broke it open while Cormac pretended to be very interested in his coffee. The letter was short. Delia Van did not use many words when a few would do. The message was this: times had grown harder. Soledad's leaving had made things more difficult. Harlan Cross had returned looking for his money back, and it would be helpful, for everyone, if Soledad came home. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened on the porch in the purple dusk. There was no word that began with sorry or I was wrong or I don't know what came over me. There was only the practical calculation of a woman working through a problem. And in that calculation, Soledad was still, as she had always been, a resource to be deployed. Soledad folded the letter carefully, crease by precise crease, and set it back on the table. She picked up her fork and finished her breakfast. When she was done, She said, without looking up, "She wants me back." Cormac said nothing. "Not because she missed me," Soledad continued, "because Harlan Cross wants his money, and she needs something to pay him with." Cormac's hands tightened slightly around his cup. The anger in him was visible only in that small motion. "You don't have to go back," he said. The simplicity of it, the absolute certainty, hit Soledad somewhere behind her sternum. She had heard many things in her life. She had heard you're useless and you eat too much, and why can't you be less of a bother? She had heard silence, which was its own kind of language. She had not often heard you don't have to, 3 words carrying the weight of a door held open, a path made clear. A choice returned to her, after years of having no choices at all. She looked at her father then, really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to before, because looking meant risking something. He looked back at her steadily. "I'll deal with Cross," he said. "He won't come here." She believed him. She didn't know why exactly, except that she had watched him stand between her and a rope without flinching, and that seemed like the kind of thing a person did once and meant forever. The next morning, Thomas mentioned carefully, in the way young men mention things they've overheard, but don't want to seem like they were listening, that Aldous Reese had ridden by the south fence the previous evening. Not crossing, just riding slowly along the boundary line, looking at the land the way a man looks at something he's decided is already his. Ezra, who was mending a bridle nearby, said without looking up, "He does that every few months. Measuring." Soledad filed this away. She had developed, over the weeks, a habit of mapping, not with paper and pen, but in her head. She tracked the patterns of the ranch, the rhythms of the people on it, the way things moved and shifted, the cattle, the weather, the fence lines, the neighbors. And now, Aldous Reese, riding along the boundary in the evening, looking at what wasn't his. That night, a second letter arrived, this one not from Cobre Ridge, but from a law office in Santa Fe. Cormac read it at the table after supper, standing up, not sitting, which told Soledad without any words that it was not good news. The letter was from a firm representing Aldous Reese in a property dispute. It claimed, with a great deal of careful legal language, that the water rights to the creek running along the northern boundary of Cormac's land had been improperly registered, and that a correction needed to be made. The correction, of course, would benefit Reese. Cormac folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Soledad. "2 problems at once," she said quietly. He nodded. Outside, the desert night had settled deep and still, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out once, sharp and high, and then fell silent. The creek was the key to everything. Without water rights to that northern stream, Cormac's cattle would be dependent entirely on the well, which was strong in good years and unreliable in dry ones. Aldous Reese knew this. He had built his legal strategy around it the way a man builds a snare, invisibly, patiently, with a complete understanding of where the animal would walk. Cormac rode to Santa Fe at the start of the following week to speak with a land attorney, a woman named Margaret Holst, who had a reputation for not losing. He left before sunrise, riding Ezra's horse because his own was favoring a hoof, and he said goodbye to Soledad at the door, with a look that held both worry and something she was beginning to recognize as trust. "You know the property," he said. "Anything feels wrong, you and Ezra handle it together. Don't do anything alone." She said she understood. She did. But understanding a thing and being able to hold to it were sometimes different in practice. On the second day after Cormac left, Soledad rose at her usual hour and found Persimmon the goat standing at the water trough with an expression of profound betrayal, because the trough was dry. The pipe from the well had been cut. Not broken. Cut. A clean slice, the kind made by a blade, not by weather or accident. Ezra looked at it for a long moment without speaking. His jaw moved in a slow, grinding motion. "Reese," he said finally. Not a question. Soledad crouched and examined the pipe. The cut was at the base, near the ground, where it would take a moment to notice and longer to fix. Whoever had done it had known exactly where to cut and had done it in the dark. This was not random damage. This was a message, and the message was clear. "We can reach you, here, even when your father is gone." Thomas had the pipe repaired by noon, working fast with a tight face and saying almost nothing. Soledad spent the morning doing something she would not have told Cormac about if she could help it. She walked the full perimeter of the north fence line, 2 miles, looking at the ground, looking at the fence, looking at the far side where Reese's land began. She was looking for tracks. She found them. Boot prints, 2 sets, both large, made sometime in the deep hours of the night and heading back north toward Reese's property. She didn't touch them. She stood there in the high morning sun with the dry wind moving her hair across her face, and she memorized exactly where they were, counting her paces from the corner post. Then she walked back. She had learned, in the weeks at the ranch, that information was more useful than action. Timing mattered. You didn't spend a card before you knew the full hand. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Woman named Celestine Okafor rode in from the east, a neighboring rancher, whose spread sat between Cormac's and the town road. She was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from patience, and she had brought a jar of dried chiles and a piece of direct information. Reese had spoken to 2 other ranchers in the valley that week, she said. He was building alliances, or trying to, telling people that Cormac Van was a man with an irregular past, debts in other counties, a family situation that didn't speak well of his character. Laying groundwork. "He does this," Celestine said, sitting at the kitchen table while Soledad poured coffee. "Before the legal move, he poisons the water socially, makes it so that when you need people to stand with you, they're already uncertain." Soledad listened carefully. She asked 2 questions. Celestine answered both directly, which Soledad appreciated. That evening, Soledad sat by the cold stove and wrote a letter. Not to her mother. Not to Cormac. She didn't want to pull him back before he had what he needed from the attorney. She wrote to Celestine Okafor, and she wrote to 2 other ranching families she had heard Cormac mention as honest people, and she wrote 3 pages total that laid out, in clear and simple language, what had happened to the water pipe, where the boot prints were, and what Celestine had told her about Reese's social campaign. She didn't ask for anything dramatic. She simply documented. She made a record, signed her own name to it, and asked the neighbors to sign as witnesses if they were willing. It was a small thing. It was also the beginning of something. She sealed the envelopes by lamplight, her jaw set with a stubbornness that Ezra Flood would have recognized immediately. Outside, the desert was dark and enormous and indifferent. Inside, at that rough wooden table, a 14-year-old girl was quietly building the first wall of her father's defense. Cormac returned from Santa Fe on the 5th day, with Margaret Holst's assessment folded in his pocket, and a look on his face that Soledad had not yet seen, but immediately understood, the particular tight expression of a person who has received complicated news and is still deciding how to carry it. He unsaddled his horse in silence, brushed her down, gave her water. He was the kind of man who took care of animals before he took care of himself, and Soledad had come to see this not as a personality quirk, but as a moral position. Then he washed his face and hands at the basin and sat at the kitchen table and told her what Holst had said. The water rights were legitimate. The original registration had been properly filed, and the documents existed. But they were old documents, fragile ones, and Reese's attorneys were very good at finding fragility and pressing on it until something gave way. There was also a second thing Margaret Holst had told him, a smaller thing, a thing that had been waiting in the background, like a figure standing just outside the light. Harlan Cross, it turned out, was not simply a local predator. He had connections to Aldous Reese, business connections, financial ones, the kind that moved in the same direction. Cormac had not known this before. He sat with it at the table, turning it over in his mind, and Soledad watched him work through it, watched the picture expand in his eyes as the two threats resolved into one larger shape. "They know each other," she said. Not a question. Cormac nodded slowly. "Cross was at your mother's place for a reason," he said. "I don't think it was just money. I think someone told him about you, about me, about the ranch." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Heavier. More specific. Soledad told him about the pipe. She told him about the boot prints. She told him about Celestine Okafor's visit and the letters she had sent. She laid all of it out in order, clearly, without decoration. Cormac listened without interrupting. When she finished, she watched his face for judgment, and there was none. What she saw instead, slowly, was something that looked like relief. Not because the situation was less serious, but because he was not facing it alone. "The letters were smart," he said. She felt the words land somewhere important inside her. Smart. Not obedient, not useful, not less trouble than expected. Smart. She nodded once and did not let him see how much it meant to her, because they were alike in that way. Both of them kept their most important feelings very still and very interior. The following day, Celestine Okafor sent back a signed statement. One of the other families responded as well, a taciturn German-born rancher named Bernhard Haas, who wrote 6 careful sentences in immaculate script, confirming everything he had witnessed about the pipe and attesting to the quality and character of Cormac Van. The second family did not respond, which told them something. Cormac took all the documents and added them to the folder Margaret Holst had started in Santa Fe. The legal case was gaining texture, gaining weight. It was still not enough. Reese's attorneys were working a different angle, not the water rights specifically, but Cormac's broader standing, his financial history, his gaps in residence, the years when he had not been present on the property, his leaving, his absence, the life he had walked away from, now being used as evidence of a character that could not be trusted to hold land responsibly. That night, Cormac sat for a long time on the front step after supper, looking at the cottonwood trees in the dark. Soledad brought him a second cup of coffee and sat beside him without asking permission. The night was cold, and the stars were relentless in their brightness, and the distant hills were just dark shapes against a slightly less dark sky. After a while he said, in a voice quieter than usual, "I left when you were 3. I shouldn't have." The words sat between them on the step. Soledad looked at her own cup. She had imagined this conversation many times, in her childhood bed in Cobra Ridge, in the dark after her mother's cruelties, in the early mornings at this ranch, when the loneliness of her own history made her chest ache. She had imagined anger. She had imagined coldness. What came out instead was something truer and simpler. "I know," she said, "but you came back." He nodded. He stared at the dark trees. She sat beside him in the cold until the coffee was gone and the night grew deeper, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The fire started in the far southern pasture on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Cormac returned from Santa Fe. Soledad smelled it before she saw it, a sharp, wrong smell riding the midday wind from the south. She was at the fence line near the eastern water trough when it hit her, and she was running before she consciously decided to run, cutting across the dry grass with her skirt bunched in one fist. The smoke rose in a thick, dark column against the pale sky, and within 4 minutes she could see the fire itself. A fast, low blaze moving through the dried grass toward the corner where 3 of the cattle were grazing. She shouted for Thomas, who was close enough to hear. He came at a dead run. Ezra was too far north to reach in time. They beat it back with wet burlap sacks and sand, working in a coughing, smoke-stung crouch for 45 minutes, while the sun beat down and the heat pressed in from every direction. The cattle scattered, but were not harmed. The fence took damage. 2 posts charred through, a section of wire twisted and useless. The fire went out. Soledad stood in the aftermath with her hands on her knees, breathing hard, her face dark with ash, her eyes stinging. Thomas stood a few feet away in similar condition, looking at the scorched earth with an expression that had moved past exhaustion into something cold and certain. "This wasn't an accident," he said. She already knew. The grass was dry enough to catch naturally at this time of year, but not here, not in this corner, where the wind patterns made natural ignition nearly impossible. The fire had started from a single point of origin. Someone had lit it and walked away. Cormac came south at a hard gallop when he saw the smoke from the upper ridge. He assessed the damage in silence, crouching near the point of origin, reading the ground the way Soledad was learning to read it. He found what she had expected him to find, the small, deliberate signs of an accelerant, and near the fence, a half-smoked cigarillo pressed into the dirt with a boot heel. Not a message exactly, more of a signature. He stood, looked at the horizon toward Reese's land, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "They're escalating." The word sat in the hot, still air, with a weight that was hard to breathe around. Soledad looked at her father's face and saw something new there. Not fear, but a kind of fatigue. The fatigue of a man who has been right about something terrible and derives no satisfaction from the rightness. The next morning, Aldous Reese came himself. He arrived at 9 o'clock in a clean black coat and good boots, riding a bay horse worth more than anything on Cormac's property, accompanied by one of his grown sons, a broad, quiet young man named Declan, who stood behind his father with his arms crossed and his jaw working slowly. Reese was 60, silver-haired, with the easy bearing of a man who had never had to apologize for anything and saw no reason to begin. He accepted coffee. He complimented the view. And then he put a number on the table that was, Soledad noted with a cold clarity, exactly the kind of number that would solve every financial problem Cormac currently had, with enough left over for a new start somewhere else. "It's a fair offer," Reese said, in the tone of a man who had decided in advance that any disagreement would be unreasonable. "Times are hard. The legal situation is uncertain. A man in your position—" He paused deliberately. "With a daughter to think about now, might want to consider what certainty is worth." He used her as a pressure point. He looked at her when he said it, directly, deliberately, the word daughter landing like a stone in still water. Soledad met his eyes and held them without flinching, and in her chest something shifted from warm to cold and stayed there. Cormac's answer was the same as it had always been. No. Rhys received it without visible reaction. He finished his coffee. He thanked them for their time. He rode away with his son behind him, and the bay horse moved beautifully through the morning light, and the dust of their going hung in the air long after they disappeared around the ridge. Ezra, appearing from the barn where he had been listening, walked past Soledad and said, without stopping, "He'll be back with something worse than an offer." She turned to watch her father, who was still standing on the porch looking north. His shoulders were straight, his hands were still. He was not afraid. But she could see, in the set of his whole body, that he understood what was coming, and that it would cost something before it was over. Soledad rode to Cobra Ridge for the first time since leaving. She told Cormac she was going to see Celestine Okafor, which was partly true. She did stop at Celestine's ranch for 30 minutes to discuss the legal documents, but she also continued into town, alone, on the grey horse Cormac had let her use, and she rode down the main street of Cobra Ridge in the mid-afternoon sun, with her eyes open and her face composed. She had not told Cormac this part of the plan because he would have worried, and worrying would have slowed him down, and she needed him focused on Santa Fe. She could make one trip into her old life and come back safely. She was certain of this in the way that young people are certain of things, which is to say with great conviction and incomplete information. Her mother's house looked smaller than she remembered. It always does, she supposed. The places that loomed large in childhood have a way of shrinking when you return with a few weeks of harder living behind you. The porch was bare. The front garden, which had never been much, was now entirely dead. She tied the horse at the post and knocked. Delia Van opened the door and looked at her daughter for a long, layered moment that contained, Soledad thought, at least 4 distinct emotions, none of which were simple. Delia looked tired. The fight that normally animated her face, the constant readiness for grievance, had faded slightly, leaving something that might have been, in another woman, vulnerability. "You came," Delia said. "I came," Soledad agreed. She did not step inside. They talked on the porch, in the long afternoon shadows, and Soledad listened more than she spoke. What she learned from her mother in Aiho, that hour was useful in the way that all true things are useful, even the painful ones. Harlan Cross had connections to Aldous Rhys. This she already knew, but the full shape of the arrangement was new. Rhys had sent Cross to Cobra Ridge specifically, not as a transaction of his own, but as a piece of a larger operation. The plan had been for Soledad to disappear into Cross's household, quietly, without legal trouble, without Cormac's involvement. A rancher's daughter vanished into a domestic situation across county lines was not the kind of thing that generated formal inquiries in 1883. She would simply be gone. And with her gone, Cormac would lose whatever softening influence a returned child created, and would be easier to break legally, financially, emotionally. He had been targeted through her. She had been the lever. Delia told her this without apology, but also without performance. She said it the way a woman says things she's had time to sit with, flatly, accurately, looking somewhere just past her daughter's shoulder. Soledad listened to all of it, and asked her questions, and absorbed the answers, and did not cry. She had decided before riding into town that she wouldn't cry, and she was a person who kept her decisions. At the end, she looked at her mother directly and asked the question she had come to ask. "Did you know that Rhys was behind it?" When you made the deal with Cross? Delia's jaw tightened. The pause was its own kind of answer. I knew there was money, she said finally. I didn't ask where it came from. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an absolution. It was just the truth. And the truth was small and ugly and ordinary, the way most truths about human weakness are. Soledad rode back in the cooling afternoon, the grey horse moving steady beneath her, the mesa throwing long blue shadows across the road. She carried in her chest the particular ache of a person who has just understood something they can never ununderstand. She had known her mother was capable of this, but knowing a thing in the abstract and having it confirmed in plain words in the afternoon sunlight were different weights. She rode and let the wind and the hoofbeats fill the space where she didn't have words yet. By the time the cottonwood trees on Cormac's property came into sight, she had organized everything she'd learned into something usable. She didn't know, riding through the last of the evening light, that 4 miles to the north, Aldous Reese was sitting at his desk writing a letter to a judge in Santa Fe, and that the letter, when it arrived, would begin the final crisis. But the valley knew, and valleys always talk, eventually. The judge's summons arrived on a Friday morning. It commanded Cormac Van to appear before the circuit court in Santa Fe within 14 days to answer a consolidated claim from Aldous Reese's legal representatives covering 3 arguments: contested water rights, alleged property abandonment during the years of Cormac's absence, and a third item that was newer and more dangerous, a sworn affidavit from Harlan Cross claiming that Cormac had threatened him with physical violence during an alleged dispute in Cobra Ridge. Cormac read the summons at the kitchen table while Soledad and Ezra watched him. His face moved through several things quickly, and then settled into the stillness she was learning to read as his most serious register. He folded the paper. He put it flat on the table. He looked at the ceiling. 14 days, he said quietly, to no one in particular. All right. That same afternoon, Declan Reese, Aldous' eldest son, rode to the property alone, without his father. He was different alone than he was behind his father. Quieter, uncertain at the edges in a way the older man wasn't. He asked for Cormac. Cormac met him at the gate, not inside it. Declan sat on his horse and looked down at Cormac, and said, in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, "My father doesn't know I'm here." The confession sat strangely in the afternoon air. Soledad, watching from the barn doorway 20 feet away, held very still. "He pushed this further than I thought he would," Declan continued. "The affidavit, Cross's statement. That wasn't supposed to happen. That was between my father and Cross. I didn't know." He stopped. His horse shifted beneath him. "I'm not saying this to help you," he said. "I'm saying it because—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Cormac took the information calmly. He did not thank Declan. He did not make promises. He simply nodded once and stepped back from the gate and watched the young man ride away, and then he turned and met Soledad's eyes across the yard, and what passed between them in that look was the recognition that the situation had just shifted. Cross's affidavit was the problem. A sworn statement against Cormac in a legal proceeding could do serious damage, even if it was untrue. But if Declan was prepared to testify that the affidavit was manufactured in concert between Reese and Cross, without the young man's knowledge or consent, that changed the shape of everything. It was not safe ground. Declan might not testify. He might change his mind. He might be convinced by his father to stay silent. But it was ground where before there had been nothing. The worst moment came at midnight. Soledad woke to the sound of glass breaking and came out of her room to find Cormac standing in the main room with a lantern, looking at the front window where a stone had come through the glass and landed on the floor. Wrapped around the stone was a piece of paper. He unwrapped it without touching the stone itself, and read it, and handed it to Soledad without comment. The message was brief and unsigned. It said, "Drop the case before Santa Fe. Sell the property, or the next thing that burns won't be grass." Soledad read it twice. She read the handwriting. She looked at Cormac. Something cold and clear was moving through her. Not fear exactly, but a kind of absolute fury that had burned so hot it had passed through its own fire and come out the other side as certainty. She set the paper on the table. "We're going to Santa Fe," she said. He looked at her. "We," she said again, deliberately. Cormac worked through the night, writing. By dawn he had produced a consolidated document that included every piece of evidence: the signed neighbor statements, the photographs Thomas had taken of the pipe cut and the fire's point of origin, the letter from Margaret Holst, Celestine Okafor's testimony, and a new section, written in Soledad's own clear hand, describing in precise detail her conversation with her mother in Cobra Ridge, including Delia Van's admission that Harlan Cross had been sent there by arrangement. It was not a legal document in the technical sense, but it was a record, a clear, signed, dated record of events that formed a pattern, and patterns were what courts were, built to evaluate. At sunrise, Ezra Flood hitched the wagon without being asked. Tomas packed provisions for a 3-day ride. Soledad braided her hair and put on her best coat and climbed into the wagon seat beside her father as the first gold light cleared the eastern mesa. The ranch sat quiet behind them. The cottonwoods moved in the morning breeze. They did not look back. The courtroom in Santa Fe was smaller than Soledad had imagined, and more formal than the desert had prepared her for. Dark wood benches, tall windows letting in white winter light. A judge named Honorius Calloway, who had a grey beard, round spectacles, and the bearing of a man who had seen every variety of human dispute and had lost patience with most of them. Aldous Reese sat with 3 attorneys on his side of the room. On the other side, Cormac, Margaret Holst, and Soledad, who had refused to wait outside, and whom Holst had agreed to include as a documented witness. The proceedings took 2 days. They were not dramatic in the way of theatre or newspaper stories. They were slow and technical and exhausting. But within them, 3 things happened that mattered. The first was the testimony of Declan Reese. He appeared on the morning of the 2nd day, without prior notice to his father's attorneys, and spoke quietly and precisely about the arrangement between Aldous Reese and Harlan Cross, about the manufactured affidavit, about the deliberate property interference, about the fire. His father's face across the courtroom went through several stages of response: surprise, fury, the careful reassembly of composure. Declan did not look at his father while he spoke. He looked at the judge. His voice was steady. Soledad watched him from across the room and understood that he had been carrying this for a long time, and that speaking it aloud was something between relief and terror, and that he had chosen to do it anyway. She respected the cost of it. The second thing was the presentation of the neighbor statements, Celestine Okafor's testimony, and Bernhard Haas's written account, and 2 additional statements from Valley ranchers who had come forward in the weeks between Soledad's letter writing and the court date. They formed a picture of a pattern of coordinated intimidation and documented it with the specificity of people who worked land and understood what deliberate damage looked like. Judge Calloway read each statement with his round glasses, low on his nose, and his expression carefully neutral. But his pen moved, and the things he underlined were the things that mattered. The water rights were confirmed as valid and properly registered. The property abandonment claim was dismissed based on documentation of continued financial investment and maintenance during Cormac's years of absence. Harlan Cross's affidavit was stricken as fraudulently obtained. The third thing was small, but not small at all. At the close of the second day, as the courtroom began to clear, Judge Calloway called Cormac to approach the bench. Soledad watched from the bench. She couldn't hear the full exchange, just the low movement of voices. But she saw Cormac nod once, and she saw the judge look past him to where she was sitting, and she saw the old man's expression change slightly into something that might have been, under the grey beard and the judicial formality, a form of acknowledgement. Cormac returned to her side and picked up his coat and said nothing until they were outside in the cold Santa Fe afternoon. Then he said, "Holst's going to send Reese's attorneys a settlement offer. He'll take it. He doesn't want this in public record any more than it already is." He paused. "It's over." The words arrived simply, without ceremony. Over. They rode home in 3 days of cold, clear weather, the wagon moving steadily south through the winter desert, with Ezra driving and Thomas riding alongside on the grey horse. Soledad sat beside Cormac in the wagon and watched the landscape change from the high country around Santa Fe, pinon and juniper and red rock, back to the lower desert of cottonwood and dry grass and mesa. She thought about her mother in Cobre Ridge. She would not go back. Not to live, not to return to what had been. But she thought, in the clarity of the moving winter light, that she might write a letter. Not a forgiving letter. Not yet. That was a country she hadn't arrived at. But a letter that said, "I know what happened. I'm not destroyed by it. This is where I am now." On the last evening of travel, with the familiar cottonwoods appearing on the horizon, and the smell of the ranch coming to her on the north wind, Soledad thought about the porch in Cobre Ridge, and the leather pouch, and the rope, and the purple bruised sky. She thought about a 14-year-old girl standing in the dust with her mouth open and no sound coming out. Then she thought about the wagon she was sitting in, and the man beside her, and the signed statements in, the leather bag behind her, and the land ahead of her, waiting. She was still 14. She was completely different. The cottonwoods grew larger against the winter sky as they rolled forward, their bare branches silver and still, and the ranch appeared from behind them exactly as it had the first morning, solid, low, unhurried, built to last. Cormac reined in the horses at the gate. Ezra climbed down. Thomas rode ahead to open the corral, and Cormac looked at his daughter beside him and said, simply and entirely, "Welcome home, Saul." She looked at the house, at the crooked door on its leather hinges, at the smoke beginning to rise from the chimney where Ezra had gone ahead to start the fire, at the wide and enduring sky. "Yeah," she said. "Home." And for the first time in her life, she meant it.